And welcome to the 32nd episode of the Online Network of Independent Learning Professionals. Pretty incredible. We're at 32. Today we're going to be talking with Karen Lubrecht about managing scope creep, which is something that we all have to deal with. So I'm super excited that Karen brought this topic up, and I'm excited about the discussion for it and just to glean some wisdom, because it can always be an issue, and if you don't manage it, it does get out of control. So I'm going to pass it over to Karen in just a second, but just like always, if you have questions as Karen is talking, feel free to put those in the chat. Karen, don't feel like you have to monitor the chat unless you just want to, and we'll get to all those questions in the second half. But maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do, and we can jump right in.
Hi, I'm a hybrid learning specialist. That means that I like all versions of training. I think they all have their place, and I enjoy looking at the training needs and trying to decide what is going to optimize the training. And I've been in the business for quite a long time, having migrated through a number of versions of this whole thing. I usually end up doing training about software, customer service, financial, pharma, and that sort of thing, and have worked with both the Captivate and the Storyline now, as well as the other types of training.
Wonderful. Thank you for that little intro and background into yourself. And Karen is here every week, and it's so incredible to, she shares her insight with us every week. So I'm glad that we get a week for her to speak to us. So why don't we go ahead and just dive into talking about scope creep and how to manage and wrangle it. Are you there, Karen?
I'm here. Can you see my screen?
No. We can't see your screen just yet. Okay. So try one more time down there with the share screen.
Okay, wait a minute, let me get.
And while Karen is getting her screen shared for her presentation, in the chat, it would be great just to hear, like, has anybody ever had problems with scope creep, and like, what's one thing that you personally do to try to make sure that it, you know, to manage it whenever you're first beginning a project? Huh. Mm-hmm.
There we go.
I've had it load.
Okay. I thought that as we're beginning that we would consider managing scope creep. I have basically worked on waterfall, Agile, although I've been trained in Agile, and I work with technology so it creeps in through that back door. And one thing that I do know as we're going through and working with all of these situations is that we need to make sure that we have our communications going. So in addition to Patty's question, I thought we'd start out with your definition of scope creep, and then I'll give you mine to try to deal with these and see where we're going. Boundaries, focus, outcomes, and objectives. Okay. So once we've lost focus, we have started on our scope creep. End goals are amended or changed. Very good. Okay. And all right. As far as we go beyond the listed statement of works and the requirement that's have already been started and are then changed. So hopefully we can agree then that scope creep would not be changing the color of a button if we haven't already started on that palette yet, or but changing a language after the screens have been developed with the images that include text, and that would be scope creep. Okay. I thought today that we take a look at the 4 different parts of this whole process. I added a few challenges, solutions. I'm looking forward to hearing your challenges and solutions as we're moving forward on the whole process. We need to start out by defining the project. And as I've said before, I'm very interested in communications. I think that's very important as we're moving along. So what is the project? What's the budget, both the time and the money? What's acceptable quality? You want a detailed planning upfront, and that's critical. And time spent upfront is going to save you time and money at the end. So what does success look like? What is your definition of that criteria? Is it a completed project in stages, or is it something that is runs through on just one stage? Remember, you want to begin with the end in mind, so you need to know what that end looks like. And once you have that defined, you can break it down to have everyone on the same page. You can have a group draw a picture or write down what they think of it, write it out in words, depending upon whether they're verbal or visual or what their process is, and then go through and review that with your group. Be careful of acronyms. They can have different meanings even within the same company. The different disciplines use the same variables in many cases, and it can be very challenging if you are not on the same page. Make sure that they're defined every time a document is created, and initially, and then you can use the abbreviation, include the abbreviation with it, and then use it on down further. Part of our best practices as you go through. We're not going to do it today because of time. Usually we have enough discussion that we don't need the activity. But Mitch Lacey has an introduction to Scrum with a definition of some of these processes, and he has an exercise that you can use with your group if you need it. And I'm going to skip it today, but I will put the link in chat in a bit. All right. So we want to go through with our statement of work. Now, the names of the documents will change between companies. They may have forms that they want you to fill out as you're going through, but you want to make sure that you create all of the same processes. Some people will have everything in the contract, some will have it in their project charter, communications plan, the statement of work. So just make sure that when you're done, you have all of the information documented in as detailed a fashion as possible in a location where everybody can find it and refer to it as needed. Once the goal or the view of success has been identified, identify the scopes in terms of what is mandatory, nice to have, and optional, and be very specific about that. You're going to need that as you go back and you look at your time breakdowns and formalize a statement of work, an SOW. Be sure you have representatives, all of the stakeholders, including the build departments, as scope and tasks are developed. Consider those involved in the work breakdown structure, the WBS. They may have some insights that you may not have considered, and so that need to be addressed prior to the beginning of the contract and the entire process. Think about things such as, is it going to be a bring your own device situation, such that you're going to have to consider not just whether the text is readable, the images are readable, whether they're going to be able to see the links that you've got, and other things along that line. Whether the training will be built in one language and translated later to others. You can accommodate that as you're building the first time, so that it is an extra time in the consecutive runs. What cultures need to be addressed? Are you going to have concerns about colors and their meaning in other cultures? That can be business culture within the company, or it can be a global culture that has to be concerned with your clients and so on. Who has the needed software and access to it during the training build, and who has the required hardware to access it. Do you have the source of your images? What's going to happen if the images you need aren't within the database that you normally use? Bundale suggests that the number of iterations required to meet the minimal must-have are included as part of your requirements. You can build in sort of variables and space holders. You know, we're going to have approximately 10 of these positions that need to be placeholders that need to be put into our storyline project or whatever. Establish a formal sign-off procedure for making reviews and the length of time before an agreement is assumed. This can be a challenge rather, if the additional charges or expenses are required. It is also going to be a concern with respect to assign the responsibilities for those sign-offs, and if someone is going to be away during a period where those sign-offs need to occur, make sure that you have a secondary signature. You want to make sure that you have backups. I was telling Patty before this presentation, I like backups for my backups, and if possible, backups for them within reason. You want to make sure that things don't go through when they shouldn't, and so on. Make sure that you use change order procedure to sign it, and then make sure that you stick to that process in detail. It may sound as though you're being very persnickety, but this is where a lot of those creeps occur, something that's silly and doesn't sound like it's going to be much of a problem.
Hey, Karen, just a quick question about those change orders.
Sure.
Have you ever had pushback from clients whenever you have submitted a change order, or do you talk about that process up front so you haven't had pushback?
That's the reason for starting this, and as I say, the conversation needs to go on from the very beginning, and this needs to be put in place. A change order procedure is not something that I dictate. It is something that we discuss, and that includes the secondary signatory and so on. The change orders usually come top down, although it can come as a result of a build that was not properly analyzed, and as in looking at it from my direction, I can see where something they mentioned in our initial discussion is going to come up, and there would be a way with the minor change now to save them work in the next iteration. And so I try to make them detailed. They can come from either direction. I do like to make sure that they include the scope and the procedure, the cost of the change, the staffing that's going to be required, whatever risk might be entailed, whether we do it or don't do it. And make sure that you get signatures from all those that are documented within this procedure. And as I say, the change orders, I have one that I share with people if they don't have one, you know, that I'll use with my clients. I usually stick it in my SOW or depending upon how they like it, my communications document. So it will appear at some point or another, and it's just a matter of documenting what changes and who's made those changes, and making sure that everyone that is needs to has signed off on the changes. Now, this is a change in what we are doing. When we come to the milestones, you want to make sure that there is a signatory process for accepting work. And it's been my process to accept work after a given period of time, and that's going to be relative to the size of the project. Scrums usually, or a sprint will usually run for about 2 weeks on most projects. So you don't have a great deal of time to wait for somebody to get back on a signature or a such. So you want to make sure that you have someone that's going to be available. Give them 24 hours or something along the line. With the change order procedures, that's going to change. But I haven't had many problems with the change order procedure, making sure that you have the acceptance, and we'll discuss it later on. That can have its challenges. So did I answer the question there? Or?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for asking. You want to make sure that you include your timelines and the reviews. Are you going to review at given milestones, and then are you going to, what is your procedure for accepting? And you do want a formal procedure for the signatories at that point. And you want to make sure that that you stay on top of them. Patty, I know that when you were discussing changes and such last week, I think it was, you commented that you actually had to get people physically in a room to get things straightened out, which I think is a fantastic idea. In many cases, we do the reviews and move along, the signatures go through without necessarily physically meeting. And that can indeed have its challenges. You want your timeline set up. If you're doing it as an external contractor, you want to make sure that the payments go through. If it's an internal contractor, it's going to depend upon how the company wants the payment made or pulled from the department, or whether they're just pulling from a general pool as you go through. But you want to make sure that you're sticking to your timeline. And if you are off from the timeline, whether it's because of a change order or whatever, make sure that the stakeholders and all the appropriate authorities are aware of the fact that there has been an impact to the timeline. When I set up my contract, I usually set up my milestones, and I have a date for the first milestone, or the signing of the contract. And then there is a timeline for the milestone, and a 2-week timeline, let's say. And so it's a date plus 2 weeks. And there is a notice within the schedule that any of the change orders can impact this timeline, and will adjust it, not just in a linear fashion, but due to the fact that the people that would normally worked on the process are working on other projects and are not available in a timely fashion as a result. And there may or may not be somebody else that can be pushed into that position to take care of it. So the reviews and the timeline are important to be in that particular schedule. Let's see. One other point is making sure that you have an idea of the termination of the project. Is this project going to end at the end of the contract, and sign it out, and how is the payment made on that? If there is a problem, how do you go about terminating the payments? What payment is made to the contractors? Is it paid to the last milestone? Is it paid to a certain amount of work percentage of the way to the next milestone, and that percentage is provided? Are there other payments that need to be made in addition to that? Who owns anything? Any images that might have been created by the artist or the people working on the project? Do they just retain those those images if they're of value to them? And is there a penalty assessed to one side or the other for either lateness or terminating the project prior to its normal completion?
Hey, Karen, this
Yes.
is Danny. I'm curious, and maybe can you just add this to our question list, but I'm curious how many people have terminated a project. I have to say in our history, we haven't terminated. I have wanted to terminate, but then we just suffer through it painfully, and we finish the project just to get it done.
Right.
I'm curious, how often in your careers as freelancers you've done that and actually terminated the project. I think we've done it once in about 5 years. And maybe that's because we're all on the same page in terms of expectations. But we have had a couple of clients where, our team has looked at each other and said, we will never do work with them again. We're not, this client we're done with. And we haven't. But I wonder, in the middle of a project, how often that has happened to you.
I've only ever had it once. And it was actually, we signed the contract. Everybody seemed to be on the same page. We had an idea of what was going on. And we went, it was actually a website development page. It wasn't actually even a training page. We had samples of what they said they wanted. So we built out, and within the agreement, we built out 3 designs and looked at that and took it to the next meeting. And I would send action items form to the head of this group, and with what was going on, who was doing what. And we had a review meeting for the design because I wanted to finalize the project and get his signature on it. And I wasn't getting the responses, and his response to me, well, I don't read the action item reports, which we were not off to a good start right there.
You're like, red flag, red flag, red flag.
Right. The 3 designs he had given as, an idea of what he was looking for in his description. And once again, as I say, the communication, even getting people to draw out where you can, they were vastly different. But we drew up 3, a version of something similar to each of the 3. And he still didn't like any of the designs. And at that point, we decided basically that there was a problem with our communication, obviously, and definitely he was not going to read the reports and respond to anything that was not in front of his face, physically a person in front of his face. So it turned out, since he was also not one to delegate a great deal, that it worked out best if we terminated. We both agreed, and at that point, we agreed to keep our work. We kept ownership of everything that we had done, and I think, I don't think there was anything that was too specific to him. There was a little bit, but there wasn't. It was just easier just to say, okay, we think you would be better finding somebody else to do this development, that somehow we don't seem to have the communication and can't seem to get this down to a point that's going to work. And he was agreeable to that. And we were as well. We went back and used the designs in other locations, so it wasn't wasted work.
Okay.
And we had ownership of it. And it was being developed on our sandbox. So, it was no loss there. But
so it was a mutual breakup, I'm
yes.
hearing.
Yes, very definitely a mutual breakup. And, as I say, to have gone through, it was one where I've learned, and it's something I should probably pass on, as you're dealing with this, not only define your terms, but do some reflective listening. This is what I'm hearing that you're saying about this. This is what I'm seeing that you like out of these parts. And, to the extent that we did that, we were still not on the same wavelength for whatever reason. So it seemed to be agreeable in our situation. That's the only time that I have actually terminated a project. I've had one that extended itself, a little bit of scope creep at the end. When I went in, I knew they had a 5-year project. They were expecting it to possibly be 5 years. And I had agreed to 6 months on board with what was going on. And we had come to the end of what I was doing, and they wanted a little more time. So I agreed to stay a little more without signing a new contract. And then we got to a point where I had other things that were going to be in the way, and needed to actually leave, which seemed to be something that was, it didn't leave the best flavor in everybody that was below the people with whom I had initially negotiated. So I don't know whether that can actually be considered a termination. It was a termination at the end of an extended contract, in that case. That's the closest I've come to it.
Well, and with the last one that you were talking about, Karen, the one for the website design, Ant was asking, if, did you get paid for anything for that? And if not, would you suggest that maybe, like, how might someone avoid that in the future? Reflective listening is really good, so I love that point. He mentioned maybe road mapping, like doing a road mapping session up front. They pay for that, and then you don't move on unless they want to move forward. So what are your thoughts about that?
I still like the idea of an initial payment, a payment for the analysis, something along that line before you get started, a prepayment going in. There's a lot of pushback with that, especially with smaller companies of late around here, with the idea that you're going to take the money and run. And I feel that we've delivered enough that people can feel that I'm responsible, and that's not the case. So I do like that idea of some payment prior to what went on. And we didn't go beyond that initial down payment, if you would, for the process, for that period of time. Because we did go through times with meetings and developing the statement of work and that sort of thing. So that was covered, and thanks, Sam. I didn't think about including that part.
So just a quick question to follow up on that, Karen. So do I understand that you're saying that you did take an initial payment on that project and you kept that money? And was the client okay with that?
Yes, they did. The client did pay for that and agreed with that because of the meetings that we had held, because of the negotiations and the work that had been put into seeking out designs that would be what they would like, as we were looking at our statement of work. What are you trying to put into this, and negotiating with that, because they were still very vague. Hi, we have a company, we want a website. Well, that's good. I'm glad. I appreciate that. I think everybody at that point, the businesses really needed them. It was prior to Facebook, and so there was a good bit of training of the customer with respect to what they needed and defining it within this statement of work itself, and getting down to the specifics of how many prototypes we were going to provide and so on as we move forward. It's just a matter of, it just seemed like no matter what you did, there was a missing communication there somehow with respect to what they were looking for. But they did pay for that, if you would, that research and that preliminary.
And so, Karen, just one more question on that point. Sure. Did the company you worked for, who was doing this, did they change their processes or anything in this onboarding procedure to try and avoid this situation from happening again?
Did I change my procedures, or did that company change their procedures?
Sorry, maybe I misunderstood. I thought you said you were working for a company and the client was a client of the company, or was this just when you were freelancing?
I was a company, a group similar to what I'm doing now. I would use contractors as I needed them to fill in the builds and such.
Okay, sorry, I misunderstood. I thought you said you were the contractor and you were working on behalf of a bigger company.
No, I was hired by a smaller company to create their website.
Okay, got it.
So as that, if you would, independent worker, consultant, contractor, I had gone into the company to create the build for them. Okay.
Thank you.
I like that we've already got so much discussion already. I knew this was going to be a good one. So yeah.
Okay. And once again, I've never had to go through the ordeal of going to court over anything. And I noticed, I was looking back at some of my contracts and things to see if there were details that I wanted to pull out to mention. And I've discovered that I actually took it out. It was in a letter of agreement, and I took it out. I don't use that as frequently anymore. Initially, I worked with small companies that did not feel that you needed a contract. They like to work on handshakes around here and in previous locations. And that being said, if you presented them with a contract, they felt like you were trying to trick them and overpower them. So many times it was written up as a letter of agreement, and then I would create the statement of work so that it looked, a little more casual, but was detailed. And because it was a letter of agreement, it included the detail, and I just said it, it's just, I haven't had to use it. It's just there in case something should happen, so that you are protected and that, where this litigation would take place. We now become global, and I don't want to be flying to I don't have any work in Ireland, but I don't want to have to fly to Ireland for litigation because the company's headquarters is in Ireland or something along that line, and deal with things along that. So having made the statement within the legal documents that we use, I know that any litigation is going to take place near me or halfway between my client and I, something along that line, to keep things reasonable.
Yeah.
Now, as you go through, the development model that you're using is something that you're going to want to consider as you're developing your documentation. Whether you're dealing with the waterfall effect, and I've used ADDIE in the waterfall. I use a cyclical ADDIE version. Some call it a spiral version. There are lots of different ways to do that, or whether you go through Agile or some other process. It does impact, or it can impact what goes on in the way of any of your scope creep and how it gets managed. It's much easier in something like a waterfall effect to manage these documentations and keep things under control. Not the easiest. And Agile does have a tendency to look a little more flexible, but those changes should come in during your changes between the iterations. And so you still can end up with some scope creep. When you're creating that documentation, that initial contract, or in your communications documents, wherever you want to end up putting it, please document the number of anticipated meetings, collaborations, and meetings. How are they going to be held? Are they going to be virtual? Are you going to get together somewhere? If you have to travel, who's paying for the travel expenses? How much time is going to be required? If I have to fly to Boston for a job, do I have to leave the night before to make sure that there's a plane and I arrive on time? With the delays that we very frequently end up with, that can be a challenge. I had a situation where I was just a couple hours away and still had challenges, things canceled after me. What is the expected time for the notification of any cancellation? I have a tendency to add sort of a 10% risk to a contract fee for the initial run of a contract till I find out how things go with that particular group, whether they're responsible or whether we end up with issues moving forward. That's just my technique on the whole thing. You want to make sure that you create a project charter that includes the communications plan, gather the contact information for the locations of the team and the stakeholders, and determine the techniques and their preferences. Document the availabilities. Is somebody on the opposite side of the globe, and they're able to chime in if you do an early meeting or a late meeting? Are weekends best for everyone? Make sure that that gets into that initial charter, and there is some kind of agreement on it prior to the workloads and the designation of the actual meetings. With respect to the challenges and solutions, they can be mitigated. They aren't necessarily going to go away. And I've included a few that I've run into, but I'm sure we'll have many others to address as we go through. Hold people to their reviews. If they are notified of a review and you haven't gotten something immediately, give them a little heads up just before it's going to be due, with enough time to actually look at the material. Make sure that if you aren't getting a response from them, that the second signator is able to go through and check and agree to it. This is a position where having something accepted, if you don't hear back by a given time, can be a little risky. I had one project where everyone was given their time and so on. We got to the alpha review, the very end of the project. The day before, they had changed the visual on the program that I was going to be training. So we needed to make changes on that. But at that point, when we were sitting there with the CLO for this particular project, we ended up with someone noticing that the audio talent had mispronounced one of the terms. And we were not only critical to our deadline, we had another issue because the audio talent was on vacation. And we needed to do a roundabout. They had had this audio clip for quite a while, but it apparently was not reviewed. They were busy with other things and they didn't take a look at it. And so the audio was assumed to be accurate. The talent that was being used was within the field and assumed to know how to pronounce things. So we did find a way to work around it. We did end up using a workaround that left the quality an issue and had to go back and make a change to the quality after the rollout. But so do make sure that people understand the importance of their review and the impact that it will have on the project. Stress their importance. And I found that that has a tendency to help people remember that they are important to the project and therefore they're a little bit better. Everybody's busy and some things slide by, but that's why I do suggest the quick review. And as Patty mentioned, I think it was last week, she pulled people into a room where they were having disagreements over the review and the policy and where people were working. So where you can move past assumptions or the fact that somebody is higher up the totem pole and therefore their decision takes priority without listening to the reasoning behind the others is important. Avoid changes in the hall. I don't know about you, but I'm on my way to a meeting. I run into somebody from a project, or we're in another meeting and we're finishing up, and as we're gathering up documents, someone will turn to me and say, Karen, let's make this change to the project. And it's important to ask them to complete the change order and remind them to send it through so that you can get everyone's on the same page. I like to go through and let them know that I don't want to forget any of the details that they've mentioned at this point, and that we do have to get the appropriate signatures. It may not be a problem at all, but we do have to go through the procedures. And there should be a big warning that flashes across their head as soon as they say, but it's just, it's just a small change. Yes, it's a small change, but we've already completed that part. So you need to go through and reiterate the fact that it may have an impact on the time or the budget. It may have already been completed by somebody other than me. It may have been completed by me and I forgot that I already did that part because I'm working on something else and focused on that at the time. Once again, little things creep, and that is why it's called scope creep. It isn't a scope jump in most cases. It's a little bitty creep, all these little details. People will tell you that an agile plan is meant to be flexible, and to some extent it is. But basically, you plan in the beginning, and then you go through and you decide on your priorities. You set up your sprints, which are very quick processing through, and they may be about 2 weeks usually, the ones I've run into. And people will meet on a daily basis to say, well, we've gotten this done. I'm running a little longer on this part, and somebody else will take over and say, well, my portion ran quickly, so I can look for that image for you and take that on as one of my responsibilities, have that for you for tomorrow and so on. You go through and review what you have. At that point, you should have a prototype ready to go and go out. And then you go back in a retrospective. And this is where the changes and the adjustments should come, is in that retrospective. And you go back and you have a chance to look at the responsibilities and where you've had the detours. Bondell has suggested that if you track the velocities during that sprint iteration, that you can end up with an idea of how things are moving and whether you're staying on task and whether you're staying focused. And it truly is the role of that sprint master, the scrum master rather, to make sure that the group stays focused and identify problems and communicate with those that are in the position to authorize changes to what's going on that may have occurred. The idea with using Agile is that you can change in these iterations, you can make changes that come up, and it's particularly helpful with things such as software, because changes are made and you want to get them done and you want product put out, and you may have something that comes up and is a better idea and will bring the company a better ROI if they make that change.
Just giving you a heads up, Karen, we've got about a minute left there.
Oh, I'm sorry. For the whole hour? Oh,
no, before we start getting into the discussion.
Okay.
So we have some time.
No, so we're, that's great because I'm on target then.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
And that's the end of that.
I can get to be bad that way. Set the expectations for your time. Don't allow others to expect you to constantly adapt to their schedule, and they will very frequently do that. It's wonderful to be known as the project saver, but be sure that it's within your parameters and that it doesn't become a favor that is assumed on a regular basis. You're always going to come in at the end of time, and you're going to work that extra time and make that extra effort to get everything going. If you're volunteering, remember that things are not, a nonprofit pays its employees, and your volunteer work is great, but people will encroach on that volunteer. They have small budgets, so they shove it off to the volunteers very frequently, and it can soon turn into a full-time job without the pay if you're not careful. So you do want to be careful to set the expectations for your time. Are there any questions?
Oh, there's so many questions and discussion that we'll have, I'm sure. Thank you so much for the managing scope creep overview there. And I know everyone deals with it a little differently, and it's really great to kind of hear some of the examples that you gave. So what I think we'll do, if you want to, you can go ahead and stop sharing your screen, and then we can kind of see people as they chat a little larger there. But I do know that Danny had something when you were talking about terminating contracts a few minutes ago. So I'm going to turn it over to Danny to kind of hear a little bit about what she wanted to share.
So I had you prompted me to think about termination a little bit, and I've certainly been in situations where you think that a project is going to get started, you meet with a client. I too ask for a payment prior to starting to make sure our time's accounted for. And sometimes you get in, and after a much deeper conversation or company priorities change, they terminate the project either because funding was lost or because priorities change. So that happened to me on a project 3 years ago. We got into the project, we started working on it, I got paid for the work that we did, but they had a shift in priorities. They were a small organization and decided not to go further with the e-learning. So I was sad because it was going to be kind of a fun project, but it is what it is. Yesterday, I got a phone call. This was 3 years ago. I got a phone call from the guy who I initially worked with, and he said, "Oh, remember that project we did 3 years ago?" And I frantically am searching my email to figure out who I'm talking to. And turns out they want to finish the project. They have more buy-in for some e-learning. Their clients are really pushing them to do it, and it's business to business. And we're going to work on it. So even when a project is terminated on their end, I think that there's always an opportunity for them to come back and be in a different time and place, because I think timing is everything, a different time and place that it might always kind of resurrect itself. And I enjoyed working with him. And so I think that's an example of a termination on their end where it's sort of come back and you just never know. So I think those relationships are so important to sort of foster and leave on a good note, if you will, because you just never know when it will come back around.
That's fantastic. Congratulations.
Yeah, we'll see.
Not only this one, they came back for the same project. Sometimes they'll come back with something else but you were reasonable to work with, and they'll come back and in that case, depending upon what you pre-built with the initial. Now, are you going to require an upfront payment again from them? Okay.
Yep, definitely. What I've learned from this group is how we were structuring our payments, and so definitely we've sort of built it on milestones, that fixed rate, asking for milestones. So we'll break it into like 3 or 4 payments and get up front, because I think they will take it to the end this time, but we'll see. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
So,
well, you never know.
Yeah.
As Patty was saying before, right now everybody seems to want to be trained. One point that I didn't think to mention is that not just with termination, but there is a section in my invoicing that notes that if payment, there's a period of time, and I don't remember what it is right now because I haven't had to deal with it in quite a while, but there is a late fee that is attached after a period of time, penalty, if you would, for not making the payments. And I think last week or the week before, at some point, I believe someone mentioned that they provide a benefit to paying early, which is.
I think that might have been Andrew. I don't remember exactly who, but yeah, I remember that. It's like a special price, if you pay early to incentivize people to pay it all up front. I think maybe that was maybe even up front. If you pay it up front, it's, okay, Andrew, 2% off if they pay within 10 days. Okay. Thank you for that, Danny. That's a really, I love hearing those real life examples of, things like that, because that's something that happens to all of us, and it's something to keep in mind. I think sometimes, like you said, you were bummed when it first happened, it's like, oh, I really wanted to do that. And then it comes back around, so it's really good. One question from Diane, this is to Karen, but also I just wanted to mention, thank you for those who signed up for the panel today, although we haven't really, it's been such a lively conversation that we haven't really gotten to you guys, but Lita, Dennis, Janet, and Diane are all on the panel. So thank you guys. So if anybody else on the panel has any thoughts about this question as well, but this is to Karen. In the design phase, do you involve different people in getting to an improved prototype? She says, for example, the marketing team might have design standards that they want included, but they wouldn't need to be involved in the learning design. So what are your thoughts about that, either Karen or anyone on the panel?
Well, from my end, I try to get a diverse group to look at it. They don't necessarily have to be at the initial scoping meeting. But certainly anybody that is a stakeholder within the project, or if we're going to look for consistency within rollout and where it's going to be used, I think that's always an important part of the conversation. And as I say, to me, conversation and that communication is critically important. So where you can have your marketing know what's going on so that they can go through and work with you. I think that's important.
Myself, at the onset of the project, I establish if there's look and feel requirements, and if they have requirements, I make sure that they discuss that with their marketing people, and I have them take on that load. And then I have, with every project, I have one person as my point of contact, and everything will channel through that person to me. I've had clients, of course, say, well, these guys aren't talking to these other guys in our company, so there's politics. So I'm like, that's not my problem. I really need one person. I need one voice, and everything channels through that person. So generally, any marketing, anything related to look and feel, anything related to subject matter, to content, etc., they've all gone through that one person. And that one person, if I have issues with something that I review, whether it be a website development or e-learning or classroom training or whatever, it's completely irrelevant. I always use that same model. And it's, honestly, if I get a lot of pushback from the client, then I'll either decide to not pursue it, or I'll pursue it and give caveats. And I'll have lots of caveats. They'll be always within the estimate itself. They'll be related to every single thing that has been identified. And I establish all of that at the onset all the time. I actually establish it prior to the project being signed or anything, to any agreement. That's how I do it.
I think that's a really...
I realize you might lose a little business. I realize some people might lose a little business in the process, but honestly, if it's going to be that big a problem, I didn't want that business anyhow. Sorry, I'd rather starve for a month than go through the hell that can be created when you don't do that.
Yeah, well, part of the reason for my asking is, I find that the problem with scope creep happens when the right people haven't been contacted. So when you're dealing with that single point of contact, in my experience, I think it's good to coach them on who they need to talk to at the very least.
Absolutely.
And also find out, how much time do you need for a review? If I'm asking you to, contact your marketing head, maybe then the marketing team needs to talk. And so it can really extend out that review process, and that design can take a lot longer than you think, especially when everybody wants a voice. I just find this is particularly a problem at small companies,
I find it can be a problem at every company, and actually way even worse in the larger companies. So what you make sure you do is you establish the criteria right from the onset. You establish the deliverable dates. You establish the rules related to missing those dates or to people missing their scheduled deliveries, and what are the repercussions of those people not getting back on time. You understand they're hiring you to be the professional at this. They're hiring you because they're looking for somebody who's done this before and been successful. So you need to drive the project. If they have their own internal project manager, even though you may not be considered the primary project manager for them, you need to actually drive that project manager by telling them, listen, I'm going to help you make this successful. Here's the things that need to be in place. Here's the kind of players that need to be in place. Here's their roles. Here's what each is responsible for. You need to have all of this up front and ready to go. And you can do this by templating the way that you do your projects and how you assign the tasks and who typically does what tasks and so on and so forth. But if you do this at the onset, you're either going to scare the hell out of the customer and they'll run away, which might be to your benefit, or they're going to be so on board, they're going to love you and keep coming back for more. That's my approach. And like I say, I lose some contracts because of it, but the ones that I keep are generally working well.
And I think if they've done an analysis of what what the project is supposed to be, that initial needs analysis is critical.
It's helpful, but it's rare.
Yes, unfortunately.
You know, this really makes me think about we had mentioned a little bit about how different ways that we manage projects. Some of us have used Excel spreadsheets. Some of us have used Basecamp, different things. Next week's community hour might be interesting to share. Like, I can kind of show you the Excel spreadsheet that's really been working incredibly for one of the project managers. And it has on there, listings for the client to see when their review cycles are. Back to Diane's point, like, if the more people that they have involved, and you've got this whole other department, they need extra time, so it can kind of facilitate that discussion in advising them, okay, here we're in the storyboard phase. Let's think about who all is going to need to be able to review this. And then going back to Dennis's point, it's got to be consolidated feedback to make sure that we get all your changes in and it's sufficient, and, really spinning it in a way that's beneficial to them, giving them the advantages of why you're looking for that consolidated feedback and having one, contact person. So anyway, just a thought for next week that we may do if we want to see each other's processes or talk about a little bit of that. Like I said, I'm happy to share my Excel spreadsheet.
And I'm teaching a leadership class next week, but I think with Eastern time, I might actually be able to attend because that'll be around lunch hour. And I can share Basecamp if that would be helpful. That has worked really well for us. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm on.
That would be incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even if you are on, even if you can only come for a few minutes,
okay.
We could just use your time whenever you're there.
Okay.
So that'd be great. Okay. Well, we are at the top of the hour, but before I let you go, I just wanted to mention as a reminder that Win Without Pitching Book Club starts right now. I've put the Zoom link in, so Ant will be hosting that. If anybody's interested in discussing Win Without Pitching or, joining in the conversation, just click that. You can go straight into that at this point. Otherwise, thank you so much, Karen. Chat love for Karen. She put together that presentation for us and facilitated this discussion beautifully. Thank you very much.
Discussion. This has been wonderful on both ends.
I agree. Yes. Okay. So we'll be here same time, same place next week. Community hour. Be thinking. Remember, community hour. The content is provided by you. So think about what you want to be chatting about. Maybe anything you're struggling with in your business. That one's not recorded. So talk freely then. Okay. See you guys next week.
Take care. Bye.
Have a great week.